They say that silence speaks volumes. But what I heard that night at Mercy Memorial Hospital wasn't silence, it was something far worse. Something that shouldn't exist in our rational world. My name is Michael Donovan, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a night shift security guard at one of the oldest hospitals in Boston. What happened during my final shift there has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. Would you believe me if I told you that sometimes the dead don't stay dead? That in the quiet corridors of certain places, the veil between our world and something else can become disturbingly thin? It was supposed to be just another routine shift, my last one before starting a new job in Chicago. 12 hours of walking empty hallways, checking doors, and fighting to stay awake. But Mercy Memorial had other plans for me that night. The evening started normally enough. I arrived at 7 p.m., signed in at the security desk in the main lobby, and got my equipment from Frank, the day shift guy. "Ready for your last rodeo, Mike?" Frank asked, handing me the radio and keycard. "More than ready," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just need to get through tonight, then I'm off to the Windy City." Frank's expression changed slightly. Was it concern I saw in his eyes? "Just keep your wits about you tonight, all right? There's been some strange reports from the East Wing." "Strange how?" I asked, suddenly alert. He shrugged. "Probably nothing. Some of the nurses claim they've been hearing things. Voices. Probably just the old pipes or their imagination." I laughed it off, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Had I not been so fixated on this being my last shift, I might have paid more attention to his warning. Would it have made a difference if I had? The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made my rounds through the main building, checking the emergency room, cafeteria, and administrative offices. All quiet, all normal. It wasn't until around 11 p.m. that I needed to check the East Wing, the oldest part of the hospital that housed the intensive care unit, and, below it, the morgue. As I approached the double doors separating the main building from the East Wing, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly known something was wrong, even before you could put your finger on what it was? That's how I felt as I swiped my keycard and pushed through those doors. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The usual antiseptic smell of the hospital was replaced by something else, something older and mustier, like wet stone and decay. I told myself it was just the age of this section of the building, constructed back in 1924 when Mercy Memorial first opened its doors. The ICU was on the second floor, and as I climbed the stairs, I could have sworn I heard footsteps echoing mine, always a few steps behind, stopping when I stopped. I turned around multiple times, but there was never anyone there. Just my nerves getting the better of me, right? The ICU was dimly lit, with only the nurse's station and the glow of monitoring equipment providing any illumination. There were 8 patients that night, all in various states of critical condition. The night nurse, Sarah, looked up as I approached. "Evening, Mike," she said, her voice hushed. "Last night, huh?" I nodded. "Anything I should know about?" She hesitated, her fingers nervously tapping on the counter. "It's probably nothing, but have you noticed anything unusual tonight?" There was again that same vague concern I'd heard from Frank. "Like what?" Sarah glanced around, making sure none of the other staff were within earshot. "One of our patients, Mr. Garland in room 4, has been talking. Which wouldn't be strange, except he's been in a coma for 3 weeks. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What's he saying?" "That's the thing," Sarah whispered. "He's not forming words. It just sounds like he's having a conversation with someone we can't see or hear." I swallowed hard. "When did this start?" "A few nights ago. Always between midnight and 3 a.m. The doctors say it's just random neural activity, But she trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. I checked my watch, 11:43 p.m. I'll keep an eye out during my rounds, I promised. As I continued my patrol of the ICU, I found myself drawn to room 4. The door was partially open, and I could see the still form of an elderly man on the bed, surrounded by beeping machines. Mr. Garland looked peaceful enough, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, courtesy of the ventilator. What made me push the door open further? Was it curiosity, or something more, some unseen force guiding my actions? As I stood in the doorway, the temperature seemed to drop again, and my breath fogged in front of my face. How could it be so cold in here, with all these electronics running? And then I heard it, a low, rasping sound coming from Mr. Garland's throat. Not words, exactly, but not random noises either. It had a rhythm, a cadence that was almost conversational. But who was he talking to in his comatose state? I stepped closer to the bed, straining to make sense of the sounds. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mr. Garland's eyes were open, just slightly, and they were tracking something across the ceiling. Something I couldn't see. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Mike, you there?" It was Diane from the front desk. I fumbled with the radio, my eyes still fixed on Mr. Garland. "Why, yeah, go ahead. We've got a situation in the morgue. Dr. Patil says one of the refrigeration units is malfunctioning. Can you head down and check it out?" The morgue? Of course it had to be the morgue. "On my way," I replied, backing out of the room. As I left, I could have sworn Mr. Garland's head turned slightly to follow my movement. But that was impossible, right? The man was in a coma, for God's sake. The basement level where the morgue was located felt even colder than the ICU. The hallway leading to it was poorly lit, with several bulbs burnt out, creating pockets of darkness between pools of sickly yellow light. Why hadn't maintenance replaced those bulbs? And why did each step I took feel heavier than the last, as if some part of me knew I shouldn't go any further? The morgue doors were heavy metal with small square windows set at eye level. I paused outside, peering through the glass. Dr. Patil, the night pathologist, was bent over one of the refrigeration units, his back to me. I pushed through the doors, and the sound made him straighten up and turn around. "Thank goodness you're here," he said, his accent thickened by stress. "This unit keeps turning itself off." I moved closer to examine the unit in question. "How long has this been happening?" "For the past few nights," Dr. Patil replied, wiping his brow. "But tonight is the worst. I've reset it 4 times already, and it keeps shutting down." I checked the control panel, everything seemed normal, but the temperature gauge was indeed showing a steady rise. "When was the last time maintenance checked these units?" "Last month. They found nothing wrong." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else too. Listen." We both fell silent. At first, I heard nothing but the hum of equipment. Then, faintly, I detected a rhythmic tapping coming from inside the malfunctioning unit. Tap, tap, tap. Fuzz. Tap, tap, tap. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Dr. Patil's face had gone ashen. "I don't know. It started about an hour ago. Could it be mechanical? Maybe a loose part?" He shook his head. "I've worked in morgues for 15 years, Mr. Donovan. I've never heard anything like this." Something compelled me to ask, "Who's in that unit?" Dr. Patil consulted his clipboard. "Jane Doe. Found 2 days ago near Fenway Park. Cause of death still undetermined." The tapping continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Fuzz. Tap, tap, tap. "We need to open it," I heard myself say. Dr. Patil looked at me in alarm. What? No, we can't do that without authorization. Something's wrong. We need to check. My hand was already reaching for the handle. Mr. Donovan, please. But his protest was cut short as I pulled the heavy door open. Cold mist billowed out, momentarily obscuring my view. As it cleared, I saw the body on the sliding tray, a woman in her 30s, with pale skin and dark hair, a sheet pulled up to her shoulders. She looked peaceful, still except for her right hand, which was hanging off the edge of the tray. The index finger was extended, poised as if to tap again. But that was impossible. She was dead. Certified, documented dead. Dr. Patil made a strangled sound beside me. This isn't right. Her hands were crossed over her chest when I placed her here. As we stared in horror, the finger twitched. Once, twice. Then the whole hand began to move, reaching out toward us with jerky, unnatural movements. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. Call Dr. Matthews, I told Patil, referring to the chief pathologist. Now, he nodded numbly and reached for the phone on the wall. As he dialed, my radio crackled again. Mike? It was Sarah from the ICU, her voice tight with fear. I need you to come back up here. Right now. What's happening? I asked, already moving toward the door. It's Mr. Garland. He's... Oh God, Mike, just hurry. I looked at Dr. Patil, who was still waiting for someone to answer his call. I have to go. Lock this door behind me, understand? Don't open it for anyone but Dr. Matthews. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. As I pushed through the morgue doors, I heard the tapping resume, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Like something trying to get out. The journey back to the ICU felt like walking through a nightmare. The elevators were too slow, so I took the stairs, taking them two at a time. The whole time, questions raced through my mind. What was happening to this hospital? What had I just seen in the morgue? And what was waiting for me in Mr. Garland's room? Have you ever had that feeling of being watched as you climb a darkened stairwell? That sense that something is just around the corner, waiting for you? With each floor I passed, that feeling grew stronger, until I was sure that if I looked back, I'd see something following me up those stairs. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. Sarah needed me, and whatever was happening, I had to face it. When I burst through the stairwell door onto the ICU floor, I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The lights were flickering more violently now, and there was a strange, low humming sound permeating the air. The ICU doors were wide open, and I could hear shouting from inside. I ran into the unit and found chaos. Medical staff were rushing around, alarms were blaring from multiple rooms, and Sarah was backing away from room 4, her face a mask of terror. Sarah, what's happening? I called out, grabbing her arm. She turned to me, eyes wide. It's not just Mr. Garland anymore. It's all of them. As if to confirm her words, a chorus of voices rose from the patient rooms, not normal voices, but distorted, rasping sounds that barely resembled human speech. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I recognized the same cadence I'd heard from Mr. Garland earlier. Where's Dr. Kaczynski? I asked, referring to the attending physician. He went to call for backup, Sarah replied. But Mike, room 4. You need to see. Despite every instinct telling me not to, I approached Mr. Garland's room. The door was fully open now, and what I saw inside made my heart nearly stop. Mr. Garland was sitting upright in bed, though sitting isn't quite the right word. His body was contorted, bent at impossible angles, his head rotated almost completely backward to face the wall behind him. But even more terrifying, he wasn't alone. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure, tall, emaciated, with skin like parchment stretched over bone. It had no face that I could discern, just a dark void where features should be. And it was speaking? No, not speaking. It was pulling something from Mr. Garland's mouth. Something long and wispy that looked like smoke but moved with purpose. I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall behind me. The figure's head snapped in my direction, though how it could see me without eyes, I'll never know. "Mike," Sarah screamed from somewhere down the hall. "We need to evacuate. Now." The figure began to move toward me, gliding rather than walking, its limbs twitching in unnatural ways. I turned and ran, grabbing Sarah's arm as I passed the nurse's station. "Hit the alarm," I told her, my voice barely working. "Get everyone out." She didn't question me, just slammed her hand on the emergency evacuation button. Immediately, a different alarm began to sound, and red emergency lights started flashing. We began moving patients, those who could be moved, toward the exit. The medical staff worked with practiced efficiency despite their obvious fear. But all the while, that humming sound grew louder, and the lights flickered more violently. As we guided the last mobile patient through the doors, I looked back toward room 4. The figure was in the doorway now, and behind it, I could see more shapes emerging from the other rooms, similar emaciated forms, all moving with that same unnatural gait. "Sarah, go!" I shouted, pushing her toward the stairs. "Get everyone down to the lobby. I'll be right behind you." "What are you going to do?" she asked, clutching my arm. I honestly didn't know. But someone had to make sure those things didn't follow. "Just go. Please." Reluctantly, she joined the evacuation. Once I was sure they were safely in the stairwell, I turned back to face the ICU. The figures had all emerged from the rooms now and were gathering in the center of the unit. There were 8 of them, 1 for each patient. They seemed to be communicating, though no sound came from their featureless faces. My radio crackled again. "Mike, where are you?" It was Frank. He must have been called back in for the emergency. "East Wing, 2nd floor," I whispered into the radio. "Frank, something's happening here. Something I can't explain. Hang tight. Police and fire are on their way. Whatever you do, don't." His voice cut off in a burst of static. I backed toward the stairwell door, never taking my eyes off the figures. They had noticed me again and were slowly advancing. That's when I saw it. Behind them, more shapes were appearing, emerging from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Dozens of them, all with that same emaciated appearance, all moving with that jerky, unnatural motion. And they were all coming toward me. I hit the stairwell door at a run, practically falling down the first flight of stairs. The door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't stop to see if it would hold. I raced down the stairs, the emergency lights casting everything in a hellish red glow. As I reached the first floor landing, I heard the stairwell door above me burst open. They were following. How many, I didn't know, but I could hear that strange humming sound growing louder. I had nearly reached the ground floor when I remembered Dr. Patil was still in the morgue. I couldn't leave him down there, not with what was happening. Against every survival instinct, I bypassed the ground floor and continued down to the basement level. The temperature dropped dramatically as I descended, until I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The red emergency lights barely penetrated the darkness of the basement corridor. I reached the morgue doors and peered through the small windows. The scene inside froze my blood. Dr. Patil was backed against the far wall, surrounded by opened refrigeration units. And emerging from each unit was a body, not lifeless as they should be, but moving, twitching, climbing out with that same jerky motion I'd seen upstairs. And among them, directing them like a conductor, was another of those faceless bodies. As I stared through the morgue window in horror, the scene inside became more nightmarish with each passing second. Dr. Patil's face was contorted in terror as the bodies, the dead bodies, continued to emerge from their refrigeration units. Their movements were wrong, so fundamentally wrong. Have you ever seen one of those old stop-motion films where the animation isn't quite smooth? That's how they moved, as if some unseen force was manipulating them frame by frame. And there, in the center of it all, was that faceless entity, its parchment-like skin glowing in eerie blue under the morgue's fluorescent lights. It turned, somehow sensing my presence, and I swear I felt something reach out and touch my mind, even through the thick metal door. What would you do if you were faced with such an impossible situation? My instinct was to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But Dr. Patil was still in there, still alive, his back pressed against the wall as the animated corpses closed in around him. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. The metal was ice cold, burning my palm as I pulled it open. "Dr. Patil!" I shouted. "This way." His head snapped toward me, eyes wide with relief. He began to edge along the wall toward the door, but one of the corpses, a middle-aged man with a gaping chest incision, lurched into his path. "Oh God, help me!" Dr. Patil cried out. I don't know where I found the courage, but I rushed into the morgue, grabbed a metal stool by the door, and swung it at the animated corpse. It connected with a sickening thud, and the body crumpled to the floor. But it didn't stay down. Its limbs began to twitch and rearrange themselves, like a spider righting itself after being flipped on its back. "Run!" I screamed at Dr. Patil, grabbing his arm as he reached me. We burst through the doors and I slammed them shut behind us, jamming the stool under the handle. It wouldn't hold for long. "What's happening?" Dr. Patil gasped as we ran down the corridor toward the stairs. "This isn't possible. None of this is possible." "I don't know," I admitted, my voice cracking with fear. "But the same thing is happening upstairs. We need to get out of the building." As we reached the stairwell, a horrible realization hit me. We were caught between two nightmares. Above us, those faceless entities from the ICU. Below us, the animated dead from the morgue. Where could we go? Is there another way out from this level? I asked Dr. Patil. He thought for a moment, then nodded. The service tunnel. It connects to the old psychiatric building across the street. It's been closed for years, but the tunnel should still be accessible. A tunnel? Great. Because narrow, dark passages are exactly what you want when being pursued by supernatural horrors. But what choice did we have? Dr. Patil led me down a series of increasingly narrow corridors, the emergency lights growing dimmer as we moved away from the main areas of the hospital. Behind us, I could hear the morgue doors bursting open, followed by that unnatural humming sound. "Here," Dr. Patil said, stopping at an ancient-looking metal door. "This leads to the tunnel." The door screeched in protest as we pulled it open, revealing a long, dark passage ahead. The air that rushed out was damp and stale, carrying the scent of decades of abandonment. "You don't happen to have a flashlight, do you?" I asked. Dr. Patil shook his head. I pulled out my phone, activating its flashlight, which cast a pitiful beam into the darkness ahead. It was better than nothing. We entered the tunnel, the door clanging shut behind us. The sound echoed along the passage, seeming to go on forever. How long was this tunnel? "It's about a quarter mile," Dr. Patil said, as if reading my thoughts. It goes under Westbridge Road and emerges in the basement of the old Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital. Blackwood. Even the name sent chills down my spine. I'd heard stories about that place, rumors of unethical experiments, patient abuses, unexplained deaths. It had been closed for nearly 30 years. Is that really any better than where we just were? I asked. Dr. Patil gave a grim laugh. At this point, Mr. Donovan, I'll take my chances with the ghosts of Blackwood over whatever is happening at Mercy Memorial. We moved as quickly as we dared through the tunnel, our footsteps echoing off the damp concrete walls. Every few yards, I glanced back, expecting to see those faceless figures or animated corpses pursuing us. But the tunnel remained empty. Too empty. The silence was almost as unnerving as what we'd left behind. Shouldn't we be hearing something? Alarms from the hospital? Emergency vehicles? Anything? About halfway through, my phone's flashlight began to flicker. No, 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 I muttered, shaking the device. Not now. Here, Dr. Patil said, handing me his own phone. But as I took it, both phones died simultaneously, plunging us into absolute darkness. Have you ever experienced true darkness? Not the kind in your bedroom at night, where there's always some small LED or light seeping under the door. I'm talking about the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face, where up and down lose all meaning. Stay close, I told Dr. Patil, reaching out to grab his lab coat. We'll follow the wall. We inched forward, one hand on the slimy tunnel wall. The silence was broken only by our labored breathing and the occasional drip of water from somewhere ahead. Then, faintly at first, I began to hear something else. Music? Yes, tinny, distorted music, like from an old phonograph. It was coming from ahead of us, growing louder as we moved forward. Do you hear that? I whispered to Dr. Patil. Yes, he replied, his voice tight. But that's impossible. Blackwood has been abandoned for decades. The music grew clearer, a scratchy jazz tune from the 1940s. Along with it came the sound of voices, laughter, movement. It was as if the old hospital had suddenly come to life again. We should go back, Dr. Patil said, tugging at my sleeve. This isn't right. But back meant facing whatever was happening at Mercy Memorial. Forward, at least, was unknown. And in that moment, unknown seemed better than the certainty of horror behind us. We keep going, I decided. But stay alert. As we continued forward, a faint light appeared in the distance. Not the harsh fluorescence of the hospital, but a warm, yellowish glow. The music was much louder now, and I could make out individual voices, conversations. Lovely gala, don't you think? Dr. Blackwood outdid himself this time. Shame about the incident in Ward C. The tunnel ended at another metal door, this one slightly ajar, golden light spilling through the crack. The music and voices were coming from beyond. I pushed the door open wider, and what I saw made me question my sanity more than anything else that night. We were looking into what appeared to be a grand ballroom, filled with people in 1940s evening wear, dancing, drinking, laughing. The room was decked out for a gala, with crystal chandeliers, floral arrangements, and a small orchestra playing in the corner. Everything had a slight sepia tone, as if we were looking at an old photograph come to life. This can't be real, Dr. Patil whispered beside me. Blackwood never had a ballroom. As we stared in disbelief, one of the partygoers, a woman in a midnight blue gown, turned and looked directly at us. Her face shifted, morphing from a pleasant smile to an expression of shock and then hunger. Her features began to melt away, revealing that same featureless void we'd seen at the hospital. We need to go, Now, I grabbed Dr. Patil's arm, but as I turned back toward the tunnel, I found our path blocked by more partygoers, all with their faces beginning to dissolve away. What do they want? Dr. Patil cried out, pressing against me as the figures closed in from both sides. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before, a small side door, partially hidden behind a curtain. It was our only chance. This way. I pulled Dr. Patil toward the door, shouldering past one of the faceless entities. Its touch was ice-cold and seemed to pull at something inside me, something vital. We reached the door and I yanked it open, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. We rushed through, slamming it shut behind us. The corridor was dark but not pitch black. Emergency exit signs provided just enough illumination to see. Where are we? I gasped, trying to catch my breath. Dr. Patil shook his head. I don't know. This doesn't match any floor plan of Blackwood I've ever seen. The corridor stretched ahead of us, doors lining both sides. Each door had a small window, but they were all dark beyond. The music from the ballroom had faded, replaced by a low, persistent hum, the same sound we'd heard at Mercy Memorial. Are we still in Blackwood? I wondered aloud. Or did we somehow end up back at the hospital? Dr. Patil had no answer. We moved cautiously down the corridor, trying each door we passed. All locked. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a sound that made my blood freeze. The distorted voice of a child, singing a nursery rhyme in a slow, twisted cadence. Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The singing was coming from around a corner up ahead. Against my better judgment, I peered around it, and immediately wished I hadn't. A small figure stood in the middle of the hallway, its back to us. It looked like a child in an old-fashioned hospital gown, swaying slightly as it sang. But there was something wrong about its proportions, the way its limbs seemed too long, too joint. We need to find another way, I whispered to Dr. Patil, pulling back from the corner. But as I turned, I found that Dr. Patil was no longer beside me. In his place stood one of those faceless entities, its void-like face inches from mine. I recoiled, falling backward around the corner, directly toward the child thing. As I hit the floor, the child slowly turned, and I saw that it too had no face, just a swirling darkness where features should be. I scrambled to my feet and ran, no longer caring which direction I went. The corridor seemed to stretch and distort around me, doors appearing and disappearing in my peripheral vision. The humming grew louder, filling my head until I could barely think. Eventually, I found myself in front of an elevator, an old, brass-gated service elevator that looked like it belonged in the 1920s. Without hesitation, I pulled the gate open and stepped inside. Anything to get away from what was behind me. The elevator had only 2 buttons, up and down. I pressed up, hoping it would take me to ground level, to freedom. The gate closed with a clang, and the elevator lurched into motion. As it ascended, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Had I lost my mind? Was any of this real? Where was Dr. Patil? Where was everyone else from the hospital? The elevator stopped with a jolt, and the gate slowly opened. I found myself looking at the main lobby of Mercy Memorial Hospital, but not as I had left it. This lobby was from another time. The furniture, the decor, all from the 1920s when the hospital was first built. And it was filled with people, doctors, nurses, patients, all going about their business as if nothing was wrong. But as I looked closer, I noticed that none of them had faces. I backed up against the elevator gate, but it had closed behind me. I was trapped in this nightmare version of the hospital, surrounded by these faceless entities. One of them, dressed as a doctor from the 1920s, approached me, extending a hand as if in greeting. I pressed myself further against the gate, searching desperately for an escape. That's when I noticed a fire alarm on the wall to my right. Without thinking, I lunged for it and pulled it down. The effect was immediate and unexpected. The alarm that sounded wasn't a modern fire alarm, but an old-fashioned bell. As it rang, all the faceless figures stopped moving and turned toward me. The humming sound grew to an unbearable pitch, and the lights began to flicker violently. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the alarm stopped. The lobby was empty now, and different, modern again, with contemporary furniture and equipment. Had I somehow returned to my own time? I moved cautiously toward the front doors, half expecting more horrors to appear. But the lobby remained empty, silent except for the distant wail of approaching sirens. As I reached the doors, they burst open, and a team of firefighters rushed in, followed by police officers and what looked like a hazmat team. "Sir, are you all right?" one of the firefighters asked, grabbing my arm. "We need to get you out of here. There's been a gas leak." A gas leak? Was that what had caused all the hallucinations? It seemed too simple, too normal an explanation for the horrors I'd witnessed. As they led me outside, I looked back at the hospital. In the windows of the East Wing, on every floor, I could see them, the faceless entities watching me leave. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that no gas leak could explain what I had seen. They took me to an ambulance, checked me over, asked me questions I couldn't begin to answer truthfully. How could I tell them about the animated corpses, the faceless beings, the impossible shift between times and places? I looked around for familiar faces, Frank, Sarah, Dr. Patil, but saw none of them. When I asked about them, the paramedics exchanged concerned glances. "Sir," one of them said gently, "you were the only one found inside. The building was evacuated hours ago." But that was impossible. I had seen Sarah leading patients out. I had been with Dr. Patil in the tunnel. Unless none of it had been real, or unless they were still in there, trapped in whatever nightmare realm I had somehow escaped from. They took me to Seattle General Hospital for observation, ran tests, found traces of carbon monoxide in my blood. That became the official explanation. A gas leak had caused mass hallucinations, and I had been unfortunate enough to be trapped inside longer than the others. But I know what I saw. And in the weeks since that night, I've been researching, trying to make sense of it all. I've found old newspaper articles about strange occurrences at Mercy Memorial over the decades, unexplained deaths, patients reporting seeing faceless doctors, staff members going missing. And Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital, its history is even darker. Experimental treatments, patients vanishing, rumors of secret tunnels used for moving problem cases between facilities. Yesterday, I went back to Mercy Memorial, now closed pending an investigation. I stood across the street, looking up at the East Wing. And there, in one of the windows, I saw a figure, tall, emaciated, faceless, looking back at me. They're still there. Whatever they are, whatever they want, they haven't gone away. And I can't help but wonder how many other places like this exist. How thin is the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond? As I sit here in my new apartment in Chicago, trying to forget what happened, I keep hearing that humming sound just at the edge of perception. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of tall, thin shapes moving just out of sight. Am I still hallucinating? Or did something follow me from that hospital? The worst part is not knowing whether I truly escaped or whether I'm still trapped in their world, living out some elaborate illusion while they feed on whatever it is they take from us. So I ask you, if you've ever been in an old hospital late at night, or walked down an empty corridor and felt like something was watching you, were you right? Are they everywhere, these faceless things? just waiting for the right moment, when the veil is thin enough for them to reach through. I don't know. But I do know this: I will never work another night shift again. Some darkness is better left unexplored.